this month is a fantastic piece of nonfiction, and I think really should be kind of required reading for every citizen. I got to say, the book is UNRIG: How to Fix Our Broken Democracy, and we're very, very glad to have our guests tonight, the author and the illustrator, author Daniel Newman and artist George O'Connor, who are there. Say hi, Daniel.
Oh, wait,
now we're unmuted. Okay.
Hi there, Brian. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well. And hello, George.
He's muted.
You've muted on your side.
Wait. Now can you
now
hear me?
I can hear you. Very good. Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you for this. As I said, I really do think that every citizen should read this. I mean, to the point where I've been like contacting high schools in the area and recommending the book and sending this to social studies teachers, to try and get this into curriculum, because I think there's some really interesting and important stuff for people to learn in here. So I want to thank you guys for that, because it's I know that nonfiction sometimes can come across as dry, but this is really engaging and really active, and I think it's an excellent book. So thank you.
So much.
Yeah, absolutely. My first question always is, before we start talking about the book specifically, generally, why comics? What is it about comics that is appealing to you? That is a way to educate people? That I would love to hear your background and thoughts about comics kind of broadly. Daniel, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I run a national organization called MacLeod that works on fixing our broken democracy and exposing money's influence in politics and passing laws to reform elections. And it's a topic that is central to all the problems and solutions that we have in our country, but it's one that's kind of abstract. And so to write a comic book really gives the potential to take this abstract topic and make it come alive, especially when working with a talented artist like George.
Yeah, very much so. Jordan, do you want to put up that URL, maplight.org? Maplight.org, yeah. Yep, thank you. Just for posterity's sake. George, same question. Why comics? You have a pretty storied career. You've got, I want to say, 15, 16 graphic novels under your belt at this point.
Probably about 15 or 16, and then there illustrated books and things. For me, I was just one of those people who grew up like comics and comic strips. Any sort of comics medium was just something that really appealed to me. I always found it really fascinating that this is Dan's first published book, widely published book, and he went for the comics route. And I think it speaks to like some of the strengths of comics. For me, I feel like I'm an initiate. And I feel like probably a lot of the people watching today they belong to Graphic Novel the Month Club. They probably understand comics. There's so much information that you can get across. In the instances where I have operated as a teacher, I always say like comics is just another way of telling a story. And you have like these two columns. You have the words and you have the pictures, and they come together and they mesh to become this something greater than the sum of the two parts. And for me, that's why, like, I as great as Dan's writing is in this book, and I'm going to be paying a lot of homage to that because Dan did an amazing job of distilling stuff down to very easy for me to interpret concepts. As great a job as he did that, I think it's the sort of thing that would still make a lot of people's eyes cross, but the pictures are something that kind of immediately invite in a reader. It kind of gives you that immediately, instead of looking at a wall of text, you see some pictures, and maybe it's like little cartoon elephants or like little, anthropomorphized money bags, something that kind of softens the blow of what he's trying to say. And I think that's why comics makes a perfect tool for telling this sort of narrative.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. So let's maybe ask the question. Let's talk about the genesis of the book. How about that? Where did you start, Daniel? Did you pitched it as a graphic novel? Were you going to different publishers? What kind of document did you have?
So I was actually contacted by the editorial director of First Second Books, Mark Siegel, about writing a graphic book about about politics and how to fix it, and that was music to my ears. I'd been long interested in writing a book, but I wasn't that interested in writing a thick, dense prose book that only a small group would read. And so I was immediately attracted to that, and Mark has worked for many years with George, and that put the two of us together. And I wanted to, following up on what George said about just making this information come alive. So let me give you an example. So back in 1888, the U.S. adopted this system that was going on in Australia and England of the government printing the ballots for each election. So that seems like common sense today, right? You get a ballot and the government prints it and it has all the candidate names. Well, amazingly, prior to that time, the political parties would print the ballot. I mean, talk about bias. So you would pick a ballot from either political party, and you could only vote for the candidate of that party because that's all that was on the ballot. So, and the point here is a small increase in government responsibility back in the 1800s led to a big increase in fairness of elections. So like, that's fine, that's interesting, right? But in George's hands, we have a flying car, like Back to the Future, goes back in a time machine, flies through the air, lands in a cloud of dust while bewildered people on horseback are looking on. And the whole thing is just so much more fun to read.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree. So the first second approached you. Do you know, did they have a whole line of books in mind at the time? Because there's at least, you can see from the back cover, there's at least 4 in the series that are coming.
Yeah, so and now actually there's quite a lot more than 4. There's over 10 that will be coming out in this new series, World Citizen Comix. At the time, it's not clear to me. I assume they had this series contemplated, but I think it's, it fits in really well as the lead book in this series about how do you educate people, not just like student age people, but everyone, about how our country actually works and how to make it actually work.
Yeah, very much so. Did you well, what is your manuscript like? Are you just sort of distilling down the facts, or are you kind of breaking it out page by page? Walk us through that part.
Yeah, so this is a big, a new learning process for me that was a lot of fun into writing a script. I mean, I write a lot of other material for prose and have for decades. And so this is really a script that in George's hands, like I'm one of the characters in the book, the main narrator, but there's other characters too. And so the word count was at a real premium. Like this, we figured out early on about how many words there are per page and how many pages we had to tell the story. And so for me, it was the opportunity to really refine and refine and refine. So not many examples, but like the very best example, and not like, 3 sentences when you could tell it in one perfectly polished sentence. So I'm really proud of that editing process that I went through in the text. And then again, with the pictures added. So you get something that really sparkles, and because it has that much attention paid to make it really tight.
Yeah. So when you wrote the script, are you breaking it out panel by panel, or are you doing it sort of in the sections that are, like this one's humility, are you going, on page 1 this, or are you just going here's humility and letting George break it down?
Yeah, so George did all the breakdown of panels and pages. It was all about the content for me. So I talked about, well, what are the main issues we're facing in our democracy? Voting rights and voter suppression, overwhelming money in politics problems, and public funding of elections to solve them, gerrymandering and unrigging the system. And I really wanted to show real people, real stories of real people that are actually making change in their community. So I had all these particular things to accomplish, laid it out in a tight outline about what would be covered when, and then wrote the script in as condensed way as I could for each chapter. And then George took it from there, like what the panels are, what the themes are. There's a chapter in the book where I'm a magician flipping over cards and show how different states have clean elections. There's another chapter in the book where I'm a doctor diagnosing democracy. All of this is George's doing. Like all the interesting things in the book are George's doing.
Great. So George, what's your process in taking what can be relatively dry material and enlivening it like this?
Well, I do want to say, like, Dan does a great job of making this stuff not live. Not, no. There wasn't much. Like, he really does an excellent job of distilling things, making it super clear and concise. I also want to kind of mention just to the idea of like the manuscript. This is harkening back to what you just asked, Dan. It was actually a little bit of a learning curve for both of us, where it wasn't simply like Dan gave me a big swath of text and I broke it down. Like, he was writing the manuscript as I was working on portions. So I think like he was learning how much we learned together. We're like, oh, you pretty much only get one sentence per word bubble, or it becomes too dense to read. So we were kind of learning these things as we were breaking it down. The book was not completely written when I had already started drawing some of the first parts. So we were kind of like engaged in this symbiosis, like this osmosis back and forth, like learning about it. As far as the process, like Dan mentioned some of the examples, like I did the Back to the Future kind of homage. I did the Magicians. I did a sequence where Dan is like this like figure who's playing with like model, like a little model town. He's like this looming figure over there. I would read Dan's text a couple times and just see if there was any sort of imagery that played out, that popped out. He was really great about supplying examples. Like he said, always the best examples too. He kind of like had brought it down to just one or two things. And sometimes they would be evocative of imagery. Sometimes they wouldn't be. And that's why it was really nice that like, I would ask him like, Dan, if you have any ideas on how I can personify this, please tell me. And it was nice that we established really early on that Dan would be a character in there. Whenever you have a narrator, they could do a lot of like kind of the carrying the narrative flow for you. It's something I couldn't figure else out. I'm like, I'm just gonna have Dan sit there and talk to us for a second, break it down to some panels. But it was really fun to put him into different outfits. I think my favorite, I somehow or another fell into the idea of embodying different, like there was these recurring characters who were I'm blanking on the word, lobbyists. And I portrayed them as like mosquitoes. And like dressing Dan up in like this extermination outfit and kind of like having him like slaying these lobbyists was really kind of a fun sequence to do. No,
when I said dry earlier, I didn't mean it like that. I honestly didn't.
No, of course.
It's more so. I was just reading an article on, I think it was Slate yesterday, and they were all kind of talking about the what are the Democrats going to do about the Supreme Court, and it was Dahlia Lithwick who kept going, but the American public goes zzz, when anything that's substantive or meaningful or takes any thought, people just tune it out, and that's what I meant is that people just tend to tune these things out, and that the art really brings it up and brings it to life and adds a lot of energy to it, that I think is going to keep people's attention. I mean, it kept my attention through the whole thing. So
you're so right. And like, I didn't for even a second interpret that you were saying it was dry, like Dan was a boring writer. It really is that thing where like, you're right. People they will tune this stuff out. Comix has this great ability to reach people because pictures are something you process immediately. There's not like you're not reading, you're not going through this conscious thought process. You see a picture and you either like it and understand it or you don't. It happens on a level where you're not having to give it conscious thought. So when you look at something like this, if I did my job correctly, if Dan and I did our jobs correctly, at least some of the meaning of what is being conveyed is given to the reader immediately just by seeing the picture. They get at least a gist of it. And that helps. That really invites you into looking at a page and reading the page in a way, like, as Dan said before, like a dense block of text, like a giant thick book. Most people won't get through that because it takes a very specific type of temperament and intellect to read that type of thing. Like some of the smartest people in the world are not going to be able to read that sort of thing because it's not their bag.
And you mentioned, Brian, like the Supreme Court. I mean, I'm so glad that this book came out right now when there is there is this critically important election at stake, when there's heightened focus on racial justice and what we can all do about that. And we're all stuck in our homes at COVID, unfortunately, because this book explains why that's true. Even though the book was written before COVID happens, there's a whole section on the concentrated effort to break down government and prevent it from doing anything, which is why our government was so poorly prepared for this pandemic. So it's very timely.
Yeah, no,
probably the strongest part of the book, I think, where Dan goes into the actual specific and deliberate effort to make government less effective. Yeah,
no, that was a very effective section of the book. I thought the whole thing was very effective all the way around. Did you have, because you guys talked about how the book wasn't finished when you started drawing it? Were you given a maximum page count? Were you given, or was it just draw it and we'll see what happens and we'll print that?
Did we have, there was something in the contract. I don't remember what it was.
There is no, I mean, what happened is we had a deadline, and so that dictated the maximum page count.
Sure.
So I knew what the topics needed to be covered in the book, and so I gave them like different allotment of pages, and we translated that into a word count. So it was pretty tight in that regard, and George did some incredible sprinting during the final few months. I mean, the amount of labor it took, I mean, really a year of solid drawing for this book, and like every panel shining. I was really impressed.
At the end, I was drawing 5 pages a day.
Wow.
It was kind of
wow. That's a lot, man. That's Jack Kirby level, dude.
Yeah, but Jack Kirby was doing a lot more per page.
Well, all right, maybe so, but still, I don't know. Seems like a harder job in a lot of ways. Yeah, I mean, I just logistically, this seems like especially if it's not written, like how much did it get easier to come up with images as the book went along, or did it get harder, George?
That's a great question. I don't know that it ever got particularly easier. I think it just depended on the subject. If anything, I feel like towards the end, because I had, I'm just looking right now, there's about 250 pages of comics in this thing. I had used a lot of ideas. So I know there was definitely like maybe a month or two out from deadline, me writing to Dan a few times, like, oh man, for the love of God, please help me out here. I don't know how to make this work. And then Dan would draw these delightful little comics that I wish we had some of those saved so I could show you like some of Dan's comics. He's like, this is what I'm thinking. And like, they were great ideas. Like I think it's so fortunate. Like, a lot of times, you team up somebody with a first-time writer who's never done comics before, there could be a gulf of difference between their understandings of things.
Sure.
He picked this stuff up so quickly. It was amazing. Like, he just really got how it should be done. He had great ideas. It was like, we're really, really lucky it came together that way.
Yeah.
One of the most fun parts was generating cover ideas. So my 12-year-old daughter and I just brainstormed the whole night, and the two of us made little doodles, because my art skills is pretty much the same as my 12-year-old daughter. But then we sent in about 24 of them to George and the second team. That was a fun thing for me to get to be an amateur artist.
That's great. Yeah, no, that's really neat. So you said that you worked entirely digitally on this, George. Is that how you normally work, or was that for this project?
So right now, if people will look behind you on the screen, you see some of, well, now you don't, but you'll see I'm probably best known, I'm certainly best known for doing a series of books called Olympians, which is
a wider shot again.
Retells Greek mythology in graphic novel form. Those I draw kind of standard, standard, old school. I draw them on Bristol plate, like 2-up. I use a G-nib pen, India ink that I mix up like from a couple different types. I pencil them lightly. It's an old school way of working, but that's a little bit more labor intensive, and it's a very different style of drawing. There's a lot more detail and kind of like granular grit visually to an Olympians book than what I wanted UNRIG to have very clear, very neat imagery that could be absorbed very quickly, like the sort of thing that you used to use for instructions, like maybe something akin to like this sort of instructions you get in an airplane, how to operate, safety features.
Yeah.
Scott MacLeod was definitely someone I looked to for this. Like that's when I thought like, oh, getting a huge amount of information across in comics form, let's look to that. And that just seemed to me like going digitally would be a really good way of doing that. It also let me, I did rough layout of text as I went.
Mm-hmm.
It's also very handy that way. It let me, if I was drawing like a specific building or a likeness, and there's a lot of likenesses, I could kind of just like drag it next to it on the page and just have it there. Turns out I couldn't trace it. That doesn't work well for me. I think there's a real art to tracing that I don't have. So, but I would have like the reference photos I found right there and be able to just draw them right next to each other. And if I screwed up, it was digital. It's a lot easier to take care of than if I was doing with like pen and ink and like an old fashioned pen.
Sure. Did you go through the usual steps of sort of penciling it and then inking it, or because it's digital, you just sort of did one pass?
There was like the equivalent. It wasn't penciled certainly, but it was like I would do kind of like blue line rough layouts. Dan, I don't remember. Did you see that stuff? Did I show you the layouts, or did I just show you pages?
That was kind of the editing process, which was also new and interesting for me as a previous like prose writer, is that the editing process is so different. Like, so I would send the scripts, George would send back these roughs, which were just like sketched in, people without faces and just very quickly done to show. But to show all the ideas and the layout was very clear. And then me and the editors would give feedback on that George would then turn into the finals.
Yeah. Let me ask you too, Daniel, about the writing part, since you were still writing it while he started drawing it.
Yeah.
Did getting those pages back in then influence and color the way you would write later sections?
Oh, hugely. I mean, mostly learning to write for this medium. Like after we did the first couple chapters, I had a much clearer idea of what worked. I had a much clearer idea of like getting the word count way down, and just in general, like once we established me as the narrator and how the general flow was going to go, that's when I like it really improved. It became I was able to output material like faster and better. The content wasn't really different because I had the book really tightly outlined before we started, but the style of it really improved once I started getting art back from George.
Yeah. How long did it take you to write it?
Took a year.
A whole year to write it. And George to draw it?
Less than a year, but I don't. What would you say, Dean?
It's about a year. It was sort of overlapping, like I started writing and then a couple months later, George started drawing. And then at some point I was finished and it was all editing after that. But the whole project was about 2 years, of which I'd say like a year for me and a year for George on the actual creation.
Yeah.
But there's a little break in there for me because I drew like the first chapter, and then there was just like, there was a little bit of period where I wasn't seeing stuff yet. I think we were ramping up, or maybe I was finishing up another project. It's weird. I know that that's not a satisfactory answer. I was so immersed in doing this book that I feel like, honestly, looking back, there's a good deal of lost time. It gets very tight deadlines. I was working on other projects simultaneously too. So I was just kind of spending, I feel like there was probably a good 8 months of that time where I was working so much that I don't really remember much beyond like just kind of working, just kind of getting there, setting up in my studio, having my computers set up, doing the work, and just kind of like not really thinking beyond that, like just letting myself exist in the world of making the book, because it would have been too scary to think of like all the things I had to do. You just kind of like, you just have to put your head down sometimes and just do the work. And we had worked some kind of schedule. I'm like, okay, I could stay in the schedule if I do this. And that was kind of the process.
Yeah. The other things that you were working on at the same time, were you doing them traditionally pen and ink, or were you also working digitally on those?
A little bit of both. So I illustrated a couple of series, or at the time I did, with Simon & Schuster. Those I actually were working on digitally. Olympians is pen and ink. There was a few side things. There was some just straight up writing gigs, things like that too, which was also like just a totally different head like thing to scratch.
So is it difficult to sort of switch back and forth between the modes as an artist? You know, not only physical versus digital, but also nonfiction versus fiction.
That's interesting. I don't know if it's so much the fiction versus nonfiction, but like I noticed if there was a day where I was drawing traditional with pen and ink, that was a day I couldn't draw digitally. And vice versa. So it was kind of like, but the next day I would have to kind of, I'm relatively good at multitasking, but not within a single period of a day. I need to kind of like have a sleep in between to reset.
Sure.
So like if I was doing UNRIG, I would do UNRIG all day. It wouldn't be a great day for me to take, and draw like some kid's book or something in between. I would have to kind of do that the next day. So it was kind of like working out the schedule like that too.
Yeah. Interesting. Let me just follow up. We'll go back to this specifically in a second, but adapting a myth like you do in Olympians versus a nonfiction book, which is kind of laid out a little more directly for you. What are the differences between those two things? Because I'm assuming that when you're adapting a myth, you're bringing in lots and lots and lots of different strands to do that.
Yeah, exactly. So when I'm adapting a myth, so here's the nice thing about working with Dan. There was a definitive text.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I could maybe argue, like say, like, can we combine this or stuff? But for the most part, that was just the text we worked on. And so it was just a matter of, it was a very neat problem solving, how to convey this text. When I'm doing something where like I'm actually writing, like where I'm adapting a myth, like in Olympians, there's an enormous amount of research that goes into it. And like, you're totally right. Most people don't get that. I was so happy to hear you say that. There's so many different strands of myth.
Yeah.
Greek mythology specifically, there's not like one Bible. There's all these different versions. So it's me kind of reading all these different source materials, finding the threads I wish to highlight and kind of weaving them together into a tapestry that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's a lot more, it's definitely using a different part of my brain. Working on UNRIG, it was very much a direct problem solving.
Mm-hmm.
Like Dan had written these beautiful texts. He did that hard work already. I just had to interpret it visually, find a way to make the words and pictures work together.
Yeah.
With Olympians, even though I'm retelling, I'm also like doing a lot of writing and kind of figuring out the best way to make everything come together to tell the theme or like the thesis I'm shooting for with this particular portrait of the goddess or god. Yeah.
Interesting. That's great. That is kind of how I pictured it, but you never know until you start asking these questions.
Yeah.
The great thing is the thing I've learned from interviewing so many cartoonists is that everybody works slightly differently, and there's no one way to make comics. It's kind of neat. I think Daniel, you may find if you work on another comic, it may be a completely different process because it'll be a different artist.
It absolutely will.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm just going to bring it up really quickly. Like when I write for comics, I tend to write and draw simultaneously. Like you look at my sketchbook and it's filled with pictures with swaths of text next to it. Like when I'm writing my own stuff, because I can't write full script and then bring the pictures to it after, because I don't feel like they're not doing equal work anymore. The words already did the work there. Yeah. I know a lot of other cartoonists who are writers and draw their own work who will write like full script. Some of them will even write notes to themselves, like he looks out the window here. I'm like, wait, what? Just draw that. You know this is in your head. Everyone does it different. It's amazing. I love it. I geek out learning this stuff.
Exactly. And then the other side are people who only do thumbnails and they'll just put like one sentence on each page that will remind them of what they were talking about. Like, has arguments, or something like that, it's amazing. I love the way comics are made. So you were making a point, George, about the number of words per page, and how long did it take you, Daniel, to get that balance, to actually figure out what's too wordy, what needs to be cut?
Yeah, not too long. Maybe after the first 20 pages of art,
okay.
I'm a pretty mathematical guy, so I just counted all the words, put them in a spreadsheet. It was 48 words a page or whatever it is, and And that's kind of like what I needed to shoot for. And like, if I wrote a chapter that, was 1,200 words, it needed to be 800. It's pretty clear how much it needs to get cut.
Yeah. I imagine you probably weren't thinking too much about sort of the mechanical bits of comics, like page turns or what information is being presented at what exact moment.
Not at all. I did get a great tip from the editor, Mark Siegel, about at the end of a section, sometimes having a question is a good hook to get people reading the next page. So I used that a few times. He advised me to read Understanding Comics, which I did read that, and the sequels to it. So I had sort of a like really basic understanding that was that with the excellent expertise of George and Mark was more than adequate to make me fit into what they needed.
Yeah, very good.
Very early on, Dan was writing a little bit more like for articles or essays where he was writing conclusions. And I remember saying to him, like, that kind of actually doesn't, it's hard because we have to have the visuals match it. And I end up almost having to repeat the images or come up with something else a second time. And so, yeah, he just very quickly, like I said something like once, and he immediately he's like, okay. And he starts doing like the question method, like just like that, like come up with these like great little buttons instead of like kind of doing what you do in an essay where you go over the same thing you talked about in the intro and kind of encapsulate everything. He would just give it this perfect little button. Like he was such a quick student for this stuff. Like he learned, I like to think we both learned a lot from each other working on this. Like it was a really fun collaboration.
And it was great to rely on George for the storytelling expertise. I mean, that's one of George's core skills. And for me, I hadn't been. And so just in terms of nonfiction writing. So there's a lot of stories of people in the book. One of the goals of this book, like right now, so many people are like, well, what can I do to affect our country? What can I do to make things better? And in this book, you will find an 18-year-old college student, and you'll find the badass grandmas of North Dakota that ended secret money in North Dakota, and everyone in between. So you can find people that are like you, their stories. And I would talk with George about, well, what are the most important elements? George coming not so much from a political background, but from an art background, like what resonates with you, what should we bring out? And so it was a real interactive process that I could make those stories come alive in interaction with him.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. That actually brings me to a question I wanted to ask as well, George, about doing likenesses, and because there's an awful lot of them in the book.
Sure.
There's a lot of stuff where you're free to use your imagination, like, as you said, the lobbyist has mosquitoes. So I guess part of that is it easy enough to jump back and forth between those two things where you're having to do fairly realistic portrayals of people and then also whimsy, and was it a challenge to do those kind of likenesses at all?
This is I learned something about myself. Like my work up until this point had not had a lot of likenesses particularly. And it turns out I actually was able to draw likenesses. I'm no editorial cartoonist, but I was actually able to draw likenesses pretty easily. Like it became a fun thing to do. It actually got to the point as we're working, if there was an excuse for me to use that likeness, I was like, cool, I know what I'm doing for this page already. Yeah. And it actually wasn't very difficult to switch back and forth. I kind of, again, the first chapter or two, there was maybe I was being a little bit more hidebound in my caricatures. There was stuff I hadn't loosened up yet. Working with with Mark Siegel, the editor, and actually Dan, like we kind of like found a medium spot for me to exist in where I could make the characters recognizable, but not so rendered that they didn't match the rest of the book.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was luck, because I was kind of like, because it's just a weird. As artists, we all have our quirks. There's the things we're not great at. There's the things we have to have an affinity for. Turns out I actually had a little bit of an affinity for caricature that I didn't know I had.
That's really neat. That's a great thing to learn on a book like this, especially. Did you run your caricatures past any of the subjects, or did you just treat this as a piece of journalism where it's fair game?
I think Dan did run the characters by some people.
It depends. I mean, the activists who are so much of the heroes and heroines of the book, I would They typically more approve the script than the final art, though. I actually went up to a woman at a conference a few months ago after the book was at the printers and said, "I recognize you from your cartoon in the book," and she didn't know what I was talking about, but it was a good way to start.
Wait, really? Do you remember who it was? That's hilarious.
Yeah, it was James Lyons Eddy. She was one of these, a field director for the Michigan campaign that ended gerrymandering in Michigan.
Okay.
Yeah,
I would send Dan on these like bizarre quests to find references for people, because I wanted to like include likenesses whenever possible. There's a lot of likenesses in this book that are actually not even identified. Like, just it would be things that were either in Dan's notes or just from me doing my own research. I'm like, oh, these are people. So I would draw them in accurately just in case that person happens to pick it up.
and also you would like, for example, in the chapter on the history of voting rights, there are some pioneering African American members of Congress that are there as part of the art that are not identified for people who, sort of as a rewards for people who know this or studied this, to say, oh, that's Shirley Chisholm and many others that are less known. Yeah.
Well, I'm from like Shirley Chisholm's old district, so she's like a local hero. I wanted to make, and I figured if I'm going to start with her, I got to have everybody. So I just started adding different people in. But yeah, it was fun doing little Easter eggs like that.
One of the funny things about this for me was on the fact checking side. It was a really different process. So not only, so I worked with some colleagues who helped on the fact checking, but it wasn't just fact checking the text, which is completely footnoted, by the way. This is one of the rare comics you'll find that is like completely sourced. And this is to every page, every fact is in the back of the book with the source and with the index as well. So we'll be fact checking the pictures as well. So it's like, okay, the 5 Republican presidents who signed voting rights bills into law. And it's like, oh, let's make sure they're all there. And is that really a picture of Gerald Ford? We better make sure it's not a picture of something else. So that was a fun part of it. Like there's a scene where we go back to 2000 and I think it was 2003. And George puts in some great pop culture references in the background. So I checked to make sure all those references really did exist. And
did you really?
I did, and we actually had to change one in the editing actually. To
wait, is that the scene of you in college? Is that the one?
Yeah, because it came out in 2004, not 2003. So we had to.
I have to find this page now. I'm sorry, it's not going to be good watching for people, but
yeah,
that's hilarious.
How much stuff did you have to redraw, George, because of changes like that, or someone going, oh wait, that doesn't really look enough like Gerald Ford, or whatever the example might be?
That's an excellent question, and again, I know this is going to be unsatisfactory. I was in a little bit of a fugue state. I don't recall. Okay. I remember earlier on there was some more stuff. Like there was maybe the first chapter I did, there was some more stuff I had to redraw. There was just some bits of storytelling that were a little bit, I hadn't fully gotten the swing of it. But I mean, Dan, do you remember me redrawing a lot?
It wasn't a lot. I mean, usually maybe 20-30% of the roughs would be like re-edited, but that was at a very draft stage. But the finals, there was very little.
That's true. We would catch most of the stuff early on. So it would be things that were in the draft. Like, we're not really sure what you're drawing here. I'm like, I don't know what I'm drawing either. So sometimes the things you draw at 3 a.m. aren't always the best ideas.
Sure. Daniel, I have to ask you, because you said you had an 11-year-old daughter. Is that correct?
Yeah, she was 11 when the book was written, and she's now 12. And who has heard George speak by coincidence and thought he was the best and funniest school speaker she had ever seen.
Oh, that's cool.
Can you talk about the crazy coincidence of this, Dan? I was literally, the day I was doing a tour of schools and bookstores in California, and I was pulling up to this one school in California when Mark calls me on the phone. And I answer it, and he's like telling me about this book he wants me to work on called UNRIG. I'm like, this sounds great. Let's talk about it afterwards. I was going to speak at Dan's daughter's school.
Oh, that's hysterical.
It was kismet. It was like I was meant to do this. I'm like.
So the question I was going to ask you, Daniel, is what did your daughter think of you as the narrator and in the various costumes and stuff that George put you in?
She loves it, and she's really absorbed the lessons of the book, and in her history classes, like brings up, well, isn't that because like these politicians are raising money to come to run for office, and the teachers kind of raise their eyebrows, and it's like, you're right, Ella, that's true. And so I'm really pleased to write a book that my daughters can read and understand. And it was also quite amazing when I came home and said, oh, I'm working with this artist named George O'Connor, and she actually lit up and knew who it was. So working in the field of political reform, it's not always that easy to explain to kids. It changes by age. When she was 6, I would say, okay, well, we monitor Obama, right? Like, we keep track of Obama, which is, really not exactly what we do. It's more like the government and politicians at whole. But it's nice that, as she's gotten older now, we have like a whole book that she can really absorb.
Yeah. What created your interest in political reform in the first place, Daniel?
So in college, I wanted to learn how to solve the world's problems, but I actually learned that the solutions already exist. I wanted to figure out the solutions, and the solutions already exist. And I realized that they're just not implemented. And then one starts thinking about, why aren't they implemented? And it's all about who has the power and what doesn't and who doesn't. And that led pretty quickly to a focus on the money that politicians have to raise in the US to run for office, and the giant corporations and interest groups and wealthy people that give that money and that have control over the system and bias it to their advantage.
Yeah. When you were in school, were you studying political science, or were you studying writing, something else?
Yeah, I studied ethics, like how people think about moral and political issues, both in graduate school and college. And so it sort of went from studying like what should people do to how do they actually think about these issues, to now it's like, well, let's make these changes actually happen and support the activists that are across the country who are trying to get big money out of politics and fix voting.
Yeah. If you were studying ethics, does that mean that you were considering being, I don't know, a philosopher or something along those lines? I mean, did you see a career path there?
Yeah, the joy of being an undergraduate is didn't really have to focus on that at the time. I mean, I had a real interest in public interest work and like, how do we improve society? And so that seemed like a good fit.
Yeah, awesome. I see Jordan. I'll get to it in 1 second. I just want to ask George one more thing. Did your schooling, George? Did you go in to study art originally?
Yeah, I pretty much. I've been a very singularly minded individual. I always knew I wanted to tell stories with words and pictures. Mm-hmm. So I went to the Pratt Institute here in Brooklyn. I majored in illustration, and I took a lot of writing courses and things too. And I actually initially, even though I loved comics as an art form wasn't quite where they weren't doing the things I want. I love superhero comics, for instance, but I didn't want to do superhero comics.
Sure.
I wanted to see comics expand out and do more things. So I initially actually broke in doing picture books, mm-hmm. Which is kind of like, you could see like there's a strong emphasis on kids in my as an audience, especially in my work. Mm-hmm. So was always wanted to do this. Just like ever since before I could even write, I would use pictures to tell stories. And so it's like stayed with me my whole life.
Yeah, Pratt, I assume, didn't have a comics program of any kind.
Not at the time. Actually, I think even now maybe they might offer a few classes, but I don't think they have a curriculum.
Right.
I did purposely seek out professors who worked in comics, as well as professors who worked in children's books and other things, because I just knew one of those things. I didn't want to just do illustrations that were in magazines and would appear and then kind of disappear. I wanted to have something that was in book form that told stories and kind of lasted for a while.
Yeah. Yeah. You never considered say the Kubert School or something like that?
No, I don't. I wonder if I didn't know about it, or if it might have been more like the idea that the Kubert School would have made me, might have been too, because Joe Kubert's so well known for his comics art, specifically Sergeant Rock and Hawkman and stuff. I thought maybe that would just kind of send me too much in that one direction.
Yeah.
And, comics, we're in my opinion, we're in a golden age of comics right now.
We are. Very much so.
All the different types of things that comics are being used to tell, all the different types of stories and narratives. And a book like UNRIG, it's like a book about how to be a better citizen.
Yeah.
And those things wouldn't have existed 10, 15 years ago And I wasn't the person to necessarily make those things happen, but I could sense that they were going to happen. And I wanted to have a wide enough aspect of my education that I could kind of be there as these things change. And I'm really lucky to have been alive and operating now, because
very much.
It's like 10 years ago.
Yeah. Do you enjoy just doing illustration work or comics better?
It's nice every once in a while just to draw something that I'm not writing.
Yeah.
And something like UNRIG, I don't view that way, because there was a lot of me doing the storytelling. There's storytelling, like making pictures tell a story is really hard.
Yeah.
There's so many different versions of it you have to work out. There's so many little variables, but the amount of satisfaction I get from doing something like that is kind of incomparable. So it's a lot more work. Like just drawing one picture is fun, but it doesn't scratch an itch the same way working on a page of comics does.
Yeah. Yeah, I get that. I understand that entirely. Okay, we have at least one or two questions I understand. If you have a question that you want to ask, just ask it in chat here or put it on Facebook, and we will be looking at these things, and Jordan will be picking stuff to put up. So what we got, Jordan? Give us a question. Podrigo, who's our best comment, he always writes fantastic questions, and I love this one.
That's great.
Can you comment on using anger as a creative energy? Daniel, do you want to start?
I say that a lot of books on democracy, prose books on democracy, go on for several hundred pages about how bad things are and exactly why. And then at the end, you get maybe a chapter with some bullet points on how to fix them. And I think that's a recipe for despair. You read the news by its very nature highlights problems. They will never highlight solutions and the people making them happen. So from my point of view, the antidote to anger is showing how change occurs. There are, I tell the story of the people George and I tell the story of the people in Seattle that brought about democracy vouchers in Seattle, the only place in the country so far where every citizen gets $100 from the government that they can give to city council and mayor candidates to get elected. So I think that, for me, it's all about opportunity and potential for change that this country has done so many times in the past. How do I put that opportunity out there so people don't have can go from anger to action?
Yeah, no, that's great. That's fantastic. Did any anger animate you at all, George?
I mean, honestly, like kind of this whole project was like, so Mark and I, in addition to him being my editor, we're friends. We've been working I knew Mark, he was a designer at Simon & Schuster on one of my picture books before First Second ever began. We've known each other for years. Yeah. And so we've just been talking, and there were so many things that are just happening in the country right now that we were just not happy about. Yeah. And honestly, I don't think that even is a partisan thing. I can't imagine on either side of the cultural divide that you're happy at the way things are right now. This government is not working well. There's a lot of things to be upset by. And the anger was such, I felt like for a while there, I was dealing with the anger in a very futile and ineffectual way. Kind of like, posting rants on Facebook or Twitter or getting in fights with people. And I wanted it to be something that I could channel into something more creative.
Yeah.
We all process our discomfort in different ways. Some people do it through sadness. I used to do it through sadness. I think I've become an angry person in my later adulthood. And so I kind of took these feelings of anger and kind of worked it out through the art. And it was really, it was very therapeutic. It was a much better way than me writing on Facebook. If you believe this, you're a jerk. That's, does that even give you a momentary sense of catharsis? I don't know. But working on something like this, there was kind of a funny bit, the way that the order of the book played out, that some of the bleakest parts just kind of came at the end when I was burned. There's one picture. If you have the book in front of you, look on page 201. There is a figure yelling, "Man, who cares? Nothing I do matters. Nothing I do makes a difference. Nihilism."
Yep.
That was me. That was just me at that moment. That was my moment of...
Yeah. And for me, during the couple of years writing this book, which are some pretty dark ones in the country, And that it was great to wake up every morning and early in the morning and work on writing this book and editing the book, because I was doing something positive to put out to the world. And I put that out there to our listeners here who are angry. And if you're it's the saying goes, if you're not angry, you're not paying attention. And I think the antidote to that is to take action, and that's what gives purpose. There's also a panel in the book about two people talking. It's like, gee, there's so many problems in the country. Somebody should do something about it, right? But the point is that you who are watching this should do something about it. And there's so many things you can do. Actually, on our website, unrigbook.com, at unrigbook.com, there's a whole list of groups that you can get involved with to actually make change and do something yourself.
Yeah. Now, we'll talk about politics a little bit. I certainly get the impression that you are both Democrats. Maybe not, but I feel like the text itself really bent over backwards to try to be as nonpartisan as it could be. Is that a fair assessment?
I mean, I'm a registered independent, and I'm really for a government that actually works for the people and not for the powerful. And I think this book really, I made a huge effort to call out like the Democrats and the Republicans who both prop up this system that it's money dominated. But I also talk about how the Republican Party was taken over by what I call the wealth hoarders, these billionaires who are trying to dismantle government. And that's not true of the Democratic Party. So, I have I'm able to really call it as I see it and really not be connected to a particular party. And that means that like there's plenty of fault to go around, but I also was really intent on avoiding this false equivocation that like both parties are just as much of the problem. When it comes to wrecking democracy, there are many people in the Democratic Party who are trying to reform the system. Not all of them, but a lot of them are. In the Republican Party, like on a national level, there is they are part of the movement to destroy democracy, which is detailed and sourced extremely well in the book.
Yeah, but certainly there is money involved with Democrats in office as well. I mean,
and there absolutely is, right? So it's sort of like there's no you can't summarize this in a line, right? But it's not just about party. It's about having the people have the power versus the political party and the politicians.
Yeah. No, that seems like the best way to go as well. I was really excited about this notion of democracy vouchers. This seems like just a fantastic way, because you bring up that San Francisco is one of the places that has public financing of elections. I gotta say, I don't know that it works all that great in San Francisco. I see a lot of people running completely unopposed. I see a lot of the same ideas being expressed. So, it doesn't look like taking the money out of it in and of itself did very much. But the idea of the democracy voucher where every single citizen has $100 they can put in, that seems like a really transformative idea to me. Can you talk about it just a little bit more?
It is. Yeah, it is. And so in the book, I tell the story of a congressional candidate, Paul Perry, who ran for office, and he was a great community leader, and he had to drop out because he was outraised. And contrasting that to Teresa Mosqueda, who was in her 30s, ran for Seattle City Council, had student loan debts, and was a renter, became the only renter and the youngest person on the Seattle City Council because she raised money from these democracy vouchers. And so it meant that you can knock on anyone's door, regardless of when they're in the poor part of town or wealthy part of town, and they have something of value to contribute to your campaign. And so it encourages candidates to turn their attention to everyone and not just the wealthy.
Yeah. Are there, Seattle's the only place that is doing this particular version, yes?
That is true so far. There's efforts in Oakland to make this happen, and other cities as well. Also, the congressional bill called H.R. 1, which was the Democrats' first in Congress first priority in early 2019, and will be again if a Democratic president is elected next month in November. This bill H.R. 1 has a tremendous amount of positive democracy reforms, including a democracy voucher system for Congress.
Really? Oh, that's interesting. On a nationwide basis.
Nationwide basis, exactly.
Wow.
Like one of the things that made UNRIG like such a pleasure to work on was that Dan really spotlighted so many instances where people were actually working. Just like he said, like so many books, it's like, this is what's wrong, this is what's wrong, this is what's wrong. Pretty much every single chapter on UNRIG, he very clearly states what the problems are, shows what we're fighting up against, and then shows how there are people, and they're almost always just kind of normal people, not different from you or I, who are doing things to work to unrig the system. And it was really amazing to read it that way. It doesn't give you like a false hope, but it does alleviate the sense of hopelessness that often can kind of overwhelm you when you're working, like when you're reading this sort of book.
Yeah, democracy vouchers, and one of the points that we make in the book is that how few people it takes to get something done. So in democracy vouchers in Seattle, the number of people that started that, 10 people.
Yeah.
Like 10 people, that's all it took to get started. In Berkeley, where I live, and passed public funding of elections, I started with just one other person, and we worked together on this for years. So it's really, you can do more than you think with just a couple dedicated people.
Sure. I wonder, because it's not a thing that gets talked a lot about. I mean, I've heard the national press talk about ranked choice voting, for example, but I don't think I've really heard any talk at all about democracy vouchers. And the fact that it was in HR1, this actually really surprises me that I haven't really encountered the idea outside of the book here. What explains that to you?
I think it's like there aren't really established channels to get like good news and solutions out there. It's like the news media, as I mentioned earlier, like just by its very nature highlights problems. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to write a book in particular. Like for the last 15 years of running my organization, MacLeod, I've been trying to get these solutions in the news, but mostly we've been getting the problems in the news because that's what makes it through the news filters. And so that was one of the reasons I was keen to write a comic book, because that way, it's a way to tell the story in a way that is appropriately uplifting and shows people like, actually, here's how these people brought this amazing reform to Seattle, and here's how you can do it as well.
Yeah. Jordan, did we have another question? We do have another question, which is David Goldman. I thought the graphics were amazing throughout and really helped set the optimistic tone. What were your thoughts drawing the quote, "Here there are problems" versus the quote, "Here they are solutions" section?
I guess that's for me. I was like I kind of touched on this a little before. I was very appreciative that we offered these solutions, that there was this sense of not overwhelming despair. Because I was treating Dan hadn't written the entire book, but I would get complete sections. So as I was getting a section, I would be kind of reading the entirety at once. Mm-hmm. So I don't know that there was like a real feeling of like me feeling like super despairing while I was drawing the bad parts and then feeling better when I was drawing the better parts, because I'd already kind of absorbed that information. The big exception being the wealth hoarders chapter, where just by the nature of that problem, where it's a network of billionaires dedicated to dismantling democracy, and some of the stuff I learned, that things that they like literally things like against the existence of public schooling. It's like things that are so core to like our country and our culture, to see them like actually on like something that they want to eradicate. It rattled me. And they've been so successful and they're so large and so ingrained that the try as Dan might, because he's not going to bend the facts or make this something that's inaccurate, there hasn't been nearly as many solutions that have been effectively put against these guys. They've been really good at what they've done. And that was a section that was really kind of rough to work on. That being said, I got to do some really fun imagery with the problems. We specifically, this billionaire group, it's headed up by the Koch brothers, who a lot of us have heard of. And Dan came up with the idea of a coctopus or a coctopus. I don't know how we're supposed to pronounce that. But I got to use this motif over and over again of like these like long black tentacles.
Yeah.
I got into drawing black tentacles, like kind of like snaking in and like manipulating things from the side. So I guess, I don't know, I'm kind of giving a really weird roundabout answer here, but I would find the fun where I could, I suppose.
Yeah, and there's no doubt that this is the only book on democracy that includes tentacles, a squirrel, and Bigfoot, which are all in the book.
Oh, thank you for me getting Bigfoot in this book was like a real victory for myself. He's not easy to see. He's just kind of in the background. He's almost a little blurry. It's really the way Bigfoot is meant to be seen.
Check the Seattle chapter for that.
Is that a thing you like working into your work, George, or just for this particular book?
I don't have it here. Years ago I actually did a picture book called Uncle Bigfoot. I'm a little obsessed, less so with Sasquatch, more so with the people who believe in Sasquatch. Don't want to like impugn anybody's belief systems here, but it's a real testament to the power of human faith that people can continue to believe in the existence of like a 9-foot tall ape that lives in like the Americas, and like nobody's found anything yet, but like I'm obsessed. Like I will do crazy deep dives listening to people talk about Bigfoot. Like I don't have it in me to believe in Bigfoot, but like these people who do fervently believe in him, I'm fascinated by.
Well, those are my favorite episodes of the $6 Million Man. So that's my.
You know that was Andre the Giant.
Was it? I did not know that.
Yeah, Andre the Giant was Bigfoot. That's like one of his first.
Wow. Hey, see, you learn something new every day. I love it. Jordan, are we cool on questions here? Okay, so maybe let's talk about the political moment that we're in right now. And I really feel like Justice Bader's death, Ginsburg, I mean, is really potentially a really dark moment for this country. It seems relatively apparent that they're going to ram through someone before the term is over, one way or the other, and then we're going to have a 6-3 court, which seems really, really dangerous to me in a way that I can't really express. So there's a lot of really good ideas in here. And there's a lot that we can do locally at a state level, but I'm really worried about the national picture. Is there something you can say to reassure us, or maybe point to specific things that we can do for people who are concerned about this issue more than anything else?
So, like, if you look at the presidential election, like, it's bound to be close. Like it was like, you think about like the difference between Donald Trump, who got elected with fewer votes than Hillary Clinton, but more electoral votes, was 100,000 votes across 3 states. Like, as my colleague says, that's the same number of people who go into a Manhattan Chipotle in a day. Like, it's just a small number of people. And so obviously that makes a huge difference in terms of the country's outcome. So the less time that you spend reading the polls online, and the more that you join one of the groups that actually is trying to elect the right person, whether that's the presidency or the Senate or your local state legislature or your local city council people, like, your efforts, not just your vote can make a difference, but your efforts can make a difference, and have so many times in the past and will this time too.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that the Senate is sort of the almost more important than the presidency in a lot of ways. Getting that flipped over. Would you agree with that, or?
I mean, it's all important, right? I mean, and it's sort of, it all matters, and it's just a question of like, we can spend our time analyzing it, which has some value, but it's really like what you actually do, like the phone calls you make, the letters you write. One of the main themes of the book is join a group. Fixing our country is not something you do by yourself. It's something you do with other people. So get together with other people. Other people have already figured out great ways to push things the right direction, the pro-democracy direction, and they are doing it. So all you have to do is ask them what they're doing, and you do the same thing.
Sure. Do you think that because the wealth hoarders have been working on this for 50 years or more, that we're going to be able to reverse it in, the most dire parts in a swift way? I mean, or is it going to take us 50 years to fix this?
So it all depends on the public pressure. So when Obama became president, he had 2 years of control of Congress, Senate, House and Senate by the Democrats, right? And he was a Democrat, of course. Did they pass any democracy reform measures, like for money in politics or voting rights? No, they did not. So why was that? It's because the party did not see it as a priority. And what makes it a priority for them? It's people like you and me telling them that this is important to fix. And it's also evident now because the attacks by the Republican Party at the states and nationally on voting has also hurt the Democratic Party, which is one of the reasons the Democratic Party is pushing appropriately to expand voting. But so you can't assume, so it's partly getting people who elected who want to actually have a democracy, and part of it is actually pressuring them to make sure that they follow through on their campaign promises to do it.
Yeah. I despair sometimes, that's all. It seems so big to me.
So I totally get that, and I certainly been there myself, reading the news, and I think the antidote to that is start doing something specific about this. Like Indivisible is a great group working on this. It has local chapters everywhere. The UNRIGbook.com website has a whole list of national groups. But what happens is then you're connected with people who feel the same way you do, and they're despairing too, and they're doing something about it, and you're not just sitting there on social media by yourself, which is sort of the default for all of us, but you take that make that effort, you do something, and it doesn't just transform the country, but it transforms yourself as well.
Yeah. How easy is it for people in strongly blue states like us in California to be able to work in places where we're needed?
So there's all sorts of ways to do that. There's certainly groups like Swing Left, for example, that are trying to focus on Congress in particular states where that's an issue. But here in California, we have a dozen measures on the ballot. Very few people have even heard about them in the news. There are things like, will protections be rolled back for gig workers? That's on the ballot. Will there be strong privacy protections for people in California, which will set a model for the rest of the country? There are things right now that you can do that as well. So it's really where you're called to work. What is the issue? What is the level? But there's a lot of opportunity where a lot of smart people out there has found ways for anyone to get involved.
Yeah. So let's stay with California just for a minute or two here. It seems to me that California overall is one of the better states in terms of open democracy. Many cities have some variation of ranked choice voting. There's a lot of efforts to get money out of politics. We have citizen initiatives, and yet major corporations like Uber, you're just mentioning it, are able to put things on the ballot that probably would never get through a legislature. Do you think that kind of access to the very questions of the ballot is always a good idea? Because it is more democracy, yeah, but if bad actors can still use it, it doesn't seem like there's a way to get money out of that part of it.
So the California with the initiative rights for the population came about just over 100 years ago, when the Southern Pacific Railroad just owned the state completely. They would own the legislatures, own the newspapers. They would have the state write checks to their corporate treasury. It was a level of obscene corruption, and from that came these reforms that give power to the people if the legislature doesn't act. And I'm really much in favor of these systems. However, I'm in favor of reforming them so that you bias the system more towards citizens' initiatives and what most people want, instead of about what just corporations paying to get on the ballot. I think you should not be able to pay people by the signature. You should have electronic collection of signatures so grassroots groups could be able to qualify things, and some small changes that would make a big difference in tilting it back more toward the people.
Okay. Yeah, because again, I'm not always sure that we're getting the democracy that we think that we're getting. We pass things that sound good, and then there's unintended consequences. There's, as I say, where a major companies with huge amounts of money at stake can try to convince people that you really shouldn't pay people minimum wage or give them insurance, and have that pose as democracy. I don't know if that question really made sense.
Yeah, it's a big problem. I mean, like my organization, along with the League of Women Voters of California, runs a website called votersedge.org. And right now you can go on and see all these ballot measures and who funds them. And so we have millions of people every election year visiting that site. And like that kind of information really helps. It makes the money less relevant. I do want to say that like California for democracy reform at the state level is like, it has some good things like expanding voting, and Secretary of State Padilla and the others in the legislature have done a great job of that. But there's some things like having public funding of elections and getting money out of politics that the legislature is very poor on. And you have interest groups like almost every major corporation, and you have unions like the California Teachers Association that have opposed public funding of elections in California. So, why don't we have like better healthcare here in California? Why don't we have, taxes on the oil companies that take out oil from the ground, like similar to taxes they have in other states? Like all of these things are about how the legislature is run. And so it's not like once you start looking at it, like it's not as pretty a picture as you might think. But the good news is that there's a lot that people can do to change government at the state level as well.
Yeah. Even when you enact good ideas, there are sometimes consequences, but there's also still a level of apathy in the system, at least here in San Francisco, that I see. For example, we have ranked choice voting, but last mayoral election, London Breed ran virtually unopposed. I think there was like 2 protest candidates, but who were never had a chance to win to begin with. So even though we're getting these good systems in, is there a way to make them work better?
There are, and like in San Francisco, there are tweaks that small tweaks that can make a big difference and make it easier for people to run. I mean, there's no one silver bullet that solves all problems. I mean, in San Francisco, it's actually one of the better cities in the country in terms of just grassroots organizations, and you have a lot of like authentic neighborhood political activity in San Francisco that has brought about many of the positive changes in the city over the past decades.
Sure. Well, I think there's also an argument that can be made that it creates a lot of negative. The whole idea of NIMBYs, I think, is not in my backyard. Came from San Francisco. I believe that's where that term originated. Well, we're all for that. We're all for a homeless outreach center, but not in my backyard. And that is one of those things that being too politically organized can also happen in a city, I've found.
Well, they say that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the alternatives, right?
Absolutely.
So the question is do we have a process that's messy but that generally gets you a functioning government, or do you have a process like on the federal level that is messy and gets you a government that doesn't function? And there's a difference between like San Francisco city politics, which has some of these big money problems, like absolutely. But at the same time, like, if there's enough citizen pressure, things happen, and you take a place like Congress where it's not necessarily so.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What do you think about the notion of voting as an obligation being mandatory?
I'm a big fan of that, based on the experience in Australia. So it turns out that when you require people to vote, and when require, it's like if you don't vote, so you get like a small fine, right? It's not like anything really bad happens to you. If you want to just go to the polling place and register yourself and not vote, like that's fine too. Mm-hmm. But the system is when people are compelled to vote, like under that system, then people educate themselves more. They pay attention more. Right now it's like too easy to tone out. Like, I don't know who to vote for. I don't have time. But if it's an obligation, so first of all, the government's prepared, right? Like, they have plenty of voting machines for everyone to vote. Like, maybe election day is a holiday, or it's just understood that people take the time to do that, or you can vote earlier on the weekend. And then very importantly, the politicians know that they're representing everybody. Right, so they're not just representing that narrow slice. I want my supporter to vote, but I'm going to run negative ads to turn off the other side. Like, that slicing and dicing is like the norm here in the U.S. But if everybody votes, then you have to represent everybody, and so it's a much better system.
Yeah, no, I think so as well. I would love to see that. What do you think about the notion of expanding the number of states, making DC a state, potentially Puerto Rico? Some of the U.S. territories?
I mean, way back, I used to live in D.C. for a year or two. Why? There's no good reason it's not a state. Like, it has more people than Wyoming, and Wyoming is a state. So I don't really see the argument against it.
Yeah. Okay. Because it seems like that would change things as well, in some pretty substantial.
It would. And, you know, the U.S. Senate is set up that it is the most now become the most unrepresentative democratic body in the world. So you know, America's democracy going back over 200 years, like, we're relatively early in modern democracies, but like, there's a lot of other like better democracy technology that has come out since then. And like most, you know, European countries elect their legislatures through what's called proportional representation, which just means like, here are the different political parties. You know, if this party gets 5%, the Libertarians get 5% of the vote, they get 5% of the seats. The Greens get, you know, 3% of the vote, they get 3% of the seats. The Democratic Socialists or the Republicans, whatever they are, like, the number of seats in the legislature matches what people think. It's like pretty basic, fair concept. But like, the U.S. hasn't caught up with that, and we, you know, partly because we were early on 200 years ago. But like, it's really time to modernize. You know, right now, the Republican majority in the Senate represents a lot less than a majority of the people in this country, just because the Republicans are overweighted with small states.
Yeah, well, and it you know, it certainly didn't let things like the impeachment pass, you know, which I think shows that democracy really isn't functioning in a really tangible way. You know, we have minority control in this country, which is odd, because we pretend, or at least certain elements of the media pretend that that's not how it is. I want to say that what did I wrote this down? 6 of the 7 of the last elections, the GOP lost the popular vote for president, and yet they've appointed 15 of the 20 judges for the Supreme Court in that same period of time. Like, how does that work? I mean, I understand how it works, but it clearly isn't a system that part of it seems really wrong.
You can also see why it hasn't changed, because there's not really the incentive for the party that doesn't hold the true majority to change this. Yeah. As long as the cards keep falling in their favor, it's not something they're going to change. Dan actually in the book, he actually has some examples where he shows how it could start not inconceivably falling the other way, where popular elections start, you know, benefiting the other party, and how then you would probably actually see some attempts to make these things change. But if there's one party that's consistently reaping the benefits from this, there's really not much, and they happen to be the party that's the dominant party in charge, there's not really much of a reason for them to go about changing the system.
Yeah, and I think that these problems with our democracy have been there for decades. And I think that the Trump presidency has exposed the ways in which America, like, we like to think of ourselves as exceptional in democracy, but we're really not. And we're facing these problems that you see in other countries about, like, potential authoritarianism and attacks on the media, attacks on voting, these things that, you know, where observers from other countries, now people from other groups from other countries want to come to America to be election monitors, right? Which is sort of like hurts our self-image as a country, because we're the ones that are like helping democracy around the world. But now, like, we have so much voter suppression that has come up in the Republican states over the last 10 years. So I think that, you know, the sort of silver lining effect is like that. I hope that this book is part of the larger wake-up call all of us. That actually we are fighting for our very democracy ourselves.
Yeah. What do you think about the role of public protest in this?
I mean, historically, that's how things have gotten done in the country. Like nonviolent civil disobedience and public protests have been a key tool for practically every major social change.
Yeah. But what of the notion that the media has allowed the conversation about violence to outweigh the conversation about what people are doing peacefully?
I mean, I think that's a very legitimate criticism of the media. I will comment on the national and worldwide protests in support of racial justice that we've seen, that and the link to some of the democratic issues here. So let's talk about the issue of police violence. One of the checks on police violence is prosecuting police who execute misconduct, violent misconduct. The role of that is district attorneys, and in most places those are elected positions. Now, because of our money-dominated political system, in most places these elected district attorneys receive money from police unions to get elected. So then they're elected with money from police officers who they're dependent on to keep them in office, and they have to make the decision: do we prosecute police officers of misconduct? And of course, they're not going to keep the public interest in mind just as much. So that's why these democracy issues and getting big money out of politics with public funding of elections have an effect on so many issues, including police misconduct and racial justice.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that you suggest is a ban on lobbying, or maybe not a ban, but how does that work constitutionally with the freedom of speech?
Yeah, so I'm not in favor of a ban on lobbying. I think that I'll tell you some real inexpensive solutions here. So Congress has just gotten less and less expertise at thinking for itself over the past decades. The staff there is underpaid, has high turnover. If you increase the amount of congressional staff, then you as a member of Congress, you can turn to your knowledgeable staff person and say, what do you think about this bill about the banking industry? And they can give you an answer that's in the public interest, as opposed to right now, it's all lobbyists, and the staff don't have enough expertise simply because they're too thin and too overworked. And you have to turn to bank lobbyists, and of course, they're going to give you a biased answer. So that's a really low cost solution. Another one is to bring back this idea from back in the Carter administration. President Carter was pushing a consumer protection agency that its job was to lobby on behalf of consumers, and they wouldn't have any regulatory power. They would just lobby all the other agencies to do things in favor of the public. This is a great idea. The business lobbyists killed it, but it's a great idea today. So you don't really need to make big rule changes or spend a lot of money to address this lobbying problem. You just have to get the political muscle and will and organization to get it done.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm asking is, there's a chicken and an egg factor here, right? The only ones who can put those limits on Congress is Congress itself. And until you turn at least enough of Congress to make those reforms, the reforms will never be made.
Well, yes and no. I mean, the Congress is very good at holding up their finger to the wind and see which way the wind is blowing. So in the 2016 presidential election, you had Hillary Clinton, who had money in politics reform as one of her 4 campaign platforms when she announced. She is the one who follows the polls. Donald Trump, a major theme of him was draining the swamp, even though he was part of the swamp just about as soon as he got elected. But he knew that would be popular. And then, of course, Bernie Sanders, whose candidacy was driven by cleaning up the system of big money and control by the billionaires. And he shot upward just based on that theme in 2016. And that has continued throughout the discourse. So that didn't happen because these politicians were like, I'm going to stand up and lead the public on something they don't care about. It's quite the opposite. The public cares about this, and that's why the politicians are paying attention.
Agreed and stipulated, but when you have an obstructionist Senate that won't let legislation even reach the floor for a vote, you see what I mean? Like, you can't solve the problem until that is solved.
Yeah.
It seems.
Well, the elections are critically important, right? And if you have a obstructionist Senate like we do right now, yeah, those things are not going to get through the U.S. Congress. So that needs to change for these reforms to pass federally. Otherwise, they can still pass at the state level.
Yeah. Okay. What the other thing that I made a note for myself that I really loved the idea of term limits on the Supreme Court, 2 justices per presidential term. That seems like it's a better solution than the notion of court packing, which a lot of people are talking about now. How do you see that actually starting, though? Because everybody who's currently on the Supreme Court was theoretically put there for life. Is that undoable?
So it's kind of, not many people know this, but you could actually implement term limits for the Supreme Court without a constitutional amendment. It's just the Congress needs to pass a law signed by the president. And the way this would work is those justices in the Supreme Court, they would rotate onto other federal courts. So they still have a job for life.
I see.
But they would just only serve on the Supreme Court for example, 18 years is one of their proposals.
Yeah, that seems like a very fantastic idea to me, and a very American idea to me too.
I like it too. That's why George and I put it in the book.
Yeah, yeah. What do you make of the return of the poll tax in Florida?
Well, these voter suppression tactics have never really left. And, what Brian is referring to is a Florida constitutional amendment that passed a few years ago that gave voting rights to people who've been convicted of felonies and already served their term, undoing a real stain on the country from after the Civil War, when the wealthy white ruling class wanted to keep African Americans from voting, even though there's now a constitutional amendment after the Civil War that allowed them to vote. So they would convict African Americans of felonies on trumped up charges and permanently take away their right to vote. And that was still on the books in Florida until just a few years ago. Now the Florida legislature, controlled by Republicans, has said, well, now you have to pay your fines to the state before you can get your right to vote back, and that's the poll tax. I mean, this is the same kind of voter suppression tactics that, like 100 years now later, long time after the end of the Civil War, like, these attacks persist and they still target African American communities primarily, and it's a continuing fight.
Yeah, no, it's horrifying. But we just saw this week Bloomberg, I think, putting together a pile of money to pay off everybody's fines for them. So are we going to be stuck with, through our inaction, one set of billionaires fighting a war against another set of billionaires?
Well, that's kind of the way it is right now, and we got to get unstuck and unrig it, I would suggest. Yeah. George, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, you put it kind of perfectly there. I mean, it is like, I definitely applaud Bloomberg and his companions' actions. I think it's really great, but the idea of us being trapped between warring billionaire factions isn't very appealing to me. We're reliant on the largesse of like a good billionaire versus a bad billionaire, depending what your visions of it are. One of the things that was so great is Dan details in many places on UNRIG, is the many attempts to kind of just take money out of the hands of the few, be they corporations or extremely wealthy individuals, and really distribute it amongst people in order to make a democracy that really actually is a democracy, not a plutocracy, not a represent, like to really have the people's will be heard. We would have to limit these monies. So Bloomberg paying off those fines is something I thought was a great thing for him to do. But the fact that we exist in a society where that is something that is being done isn't great. Am I being clear here?
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I agree.
Something that had to have been done, And while I think he did a good thing, it was a good spending of his wealth, like it still makes me nervous. It still makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah, I wonder if some of these things are just going to be harder to solve in America because of the way that we valorize capitalism as opposed to other values. The American myth of that you can rise from nothing, and as long as a couple of people are rising from nothing to become rich every year or every generation, that tricks a lot of people into thinking that that part of the American dream is achievable for everybody. But that's still the narrative, but it doesn't seem like it's true anymore. I think even in terms of just something as simple as me owning a comic book store. Okay. I opened this store 32 years ago with $10,000 in my personal comic book collection. Couldn't do that today in a million years. So the fact that I'm a self-made business person who's able to live a relatively comfortable life doing a thing that I enjoy couldn't happen anymore. And I know that it couldn't happen anymore. And but we still sell this myth as a society that it can happen, and it happens enough that everybody's fine.
Well, I think that's one of the big changes is like the idea that equality, there's opportunity in the U.S. and now like the chance that if you divide society into 5 income groups, equal amounts of people, like the mobility between those income groups has gone so far down, it's less than so many other countries. So this story in myth is like not factually accurate. But I think part of the point of the wealth hoarder section of our book is that there are people that are literally investing,
correct,
and putting this myth out there because it serves them.
Yeah.
Now I will say too, like as we're careful to say in the book, like most rich people understand that taxes are the price of living in a civilized society, and many wealthy people want to see society as a whole succeed. But it's just this really tiny slice, just like really a few hundred families that has this like way out there different view. That's great for diversity of opinion. It's not so great when they can use their billions to hire tens of thousands of people to push the country in their direction.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's what people power for. Democracy vouchers all around the world. I like this. Jordan tells me we have another question. Give us that next question. Rodrigo again. What would you say to a wealth hoarder if you had the opportunity to face one right now?
Ooh.
I don't know if there's much to be said. They have their own ideology that they have, hired people to write volumes of books about, and I think they're just intent on pursuing their agenda. I think it's really what I want to say to everybody else to expose the plan that they're putting into action that requires disabling democracy. Like the central point here is that in a well-functioning representative democracy, where the people are in charge, and the people are always going to tax the very wealthy in society to some extent to pay for things like public schools and healthcare, things that make society better for everyone and that give everyone the opportunity to have upward mobility. But that there's just a small group of people who doesn't think that way, and that's fine if they don't think that way. But the problem is when they're rigging the rules of government to make it anti-democracy.
Yeah.
Yeah, Patrego, I don't think there's anything that I'm not a super cynical person, but I don't believe that there's anything I could effectively communicate to that person to make them see beyond their already adopted worldview. That's kind of the problem we're facing all over the place here. You see the world a certain way, and it can be very difficult to convince people otherwise. This, kind of goes back to the last question, just the idea of the myth of American mobility. It has become mythic. It used to be something that was maybe more prevalent, but people grow up with that idea, or they just have that idea so closely held to them. They're not necessarily going to see the information that maybe invalidates that view, or not invalidates, but expands their view so they can see what's really happening. I don't think there's a single thing I could say to somebody who is a wealth hoarder that will make them think that they are wrong. I think they view themselves as absolutely correct, but I think it's like what Dan says, like diversity of opinion is one thing, that's great, but when your diversity of opinion is actually your putting in effect things that are removing diversity of actions for other people, that's where the real problem comes in.
Yeah. I would hope that they would understand a certain amount of logic, that if the populace is dumber and sicker and poorer, then they have less ability to be consumers to allow you to get more wealth, right? Like, I just from a logical point of view, you would think that whatever.
Yeah, I think there would be, like, in order for the population as a whole to get poorer, sicker, and less capable of being consumers, it would be such an enormous, I mean, like, we would have to be talking like plagues killing off people. There's a lot of folks in this country. There's always going to be enough people, and it hasn't hit them yet. And really keeping, I think they found that having less education makes the population easier to manipulate. So,
yeah, I think it's it's a basic self-oriented philosophy. I mean, one of the texts that we talk about in the book is this article from the 70s by this wealth hoarder economist that talks about the parable of Jesus and Jesus's parable about the Good Samaritan, where this traveler from Samaria finds this someone who's been beaten by robbers and left for dead. And the idea is that you help out other people in need, like even if they're from a different tribe, like you help them out. And that this article by this economist named Buchanan went on to say, well, Jesus had it wrong, and we should basically let these people die. I mean, there's a whole philosophy around this, and they justified it to themselves and a few other people, but it doesn't really take into effect about everyone. It's really everybody's out for themselves.
Yeah. So sociopathy, I think. Well, okay, but we can take the power back. Jordan, put this URL up. This is the follow up to the book, unrigbook.com. There's a lot of good stuff there about what you can do. Do you want to, Daniel, maybe talk about some of the resources that are here for people?
Yeah, so the number one thing to do to help fix a democracy is to join a group that is working on this. And as I said earlier, if you're angry, which is a sign of mental health, I think, at this point in the country, and you want to channel that to productive use, then join a group and start working on it. And if you're feeling kind of depressed and despairing, which many of us are at various times, like join a group and start getting something done. And ideally a group, we can't meet in person really right now, but ideally a group that has like some video conferences so you can see people face to face. Like if you're just on Facebook or you're just on email, like that doesn't provide like the oomph and the connections that you need. On the site is a list of great groups that are working at the federal, state, and local levels. See what speaks to you and get involved.
How many groups would you say are listed?
So there's about I'd say about 50 to 60 at least, and some of those groups, like the League of Women Voters and the NAACP and others, have local chapters as well.
Okay, so there's something for someone in every state?
There's something for someone in every state.
Okay, excellent. So I would definitely encourage viewers to, if you want to get involved, to do that. I want to thank you guys for this book. I really do. I thought this was an important book that has a lot of things to say, a lot of good information, a lot of things to make you feel better about being an American. But it's going to take our work to do that. And I'm really glad that I was able to put this out to the members of our club and that we're able to have this conversation. And I want to thank you guys for being part of this today.
Thank you so much for having us. It's a weird time for a book to drop, but it's always great to get out and talk about this book. It's for me personally, it was a really amazing experience getting to work on this. It really meant a lot to me to stretch my creative muscles this way, to be able to put them towards something that I viewed as, it was cathartic. It was constructive. There were so many things. And thank you very much, Dan, for putting together this amazing text and just doing this work and this research and kind of showing all these things that can be done and are being done.
Oh, thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Brian, for bringing this book forward to your audience, and to George for a partner on this. And I think I really wanted to write something that's the text for people. How do you make change in the country? And we got to do it in comics.
Yeah, no, very good. The last question I usually ask, well, there's two questions there really. So one is, we have a lot of people who are watching who want to do comics on their own. If there's a piece of advice that either one of you, Daniel, you may not have a piece of advice specifically, but people who want to break into comics, what would that advice be?
I guess I'll take that.
Yeah, I guess.
So there's this, I was literally just saying this to someone earlier today. There's this old saying about like nobody breaks into comics the same way twice. And once you break in, they change it. There's a million different ways to do it. For me, I mentioned already, I broke in doing kids books first, but in this day and age, I've been working for a bit, so I kind of maybe came in an old-fashioned way, but with the role of social media and the ability to just kind of publish things and put them online, my advice to someone who wants to make a comic is to make something that is short. Don't make something that's crazy long. Don't make your first comic a 250-page sci-fi epic that's going to tell like a short contained story, something that is universal, that can really can touch on these bigger themes, but just speaks to whatever it is you want to get out there. Make sure there's an emotional hook to it. Treat the writing and the drawing equally at the same time, and just put it out there. Let it exist. You could go to shows when the world gets back to normal and print as many comics, but post it up online in some way. Don't be worried about people stealing intellectual property. You will own the originals. You'll have ways of taking care of this. Just let it be seen, because so many amazing cartoonists just don't get their work. They don't let their work be seen in the first place.
Yeah.
Just let it just come out and just be there, and just keep doing it. Just do a lot of comics. Don't worry about making perfect drawings. I could take any page of UNRIG and show you a dozen things that I could have drawn better or that were just not quite right. When you're reading a comic, and I'm sure you all read comics if you're watching this, you don't necessarily examine every single panel like that. It's a conveyance of telling a story, the words and the pictures. Things are going to gloss over. Don't be this harsh critic on yourself to the degree that you won't actually let your work get out there. Just create it and put it out and have people read it.
It's excellent advice.
Nice.
I like that. That's excellent advice. Daniel, you got anything you want to add to that?
I think that says it all.
Okay, very good. So then the last thing that I'll do is there, you guys have any upcoming work, something that you want to plug? George?
Let's see. I'm working on the 12th volume of Olympians right now. It's going to wrap up the series, and from there, I am going to do a 4-book series. I don't know if it's been announced yet, so this might be a scoop, on Norse mythology called Asgardians.
Nice.
During the pandemic, which is still ongoing, I belong to a studio of other comics artists here in Brooklyn. We did an anthology comic called Pandemics, a group of artists. It benefits the Hero Initiative. It's like a charity thing. If you look at Pandemics, Comics in the Age of Rona, you can find it. And for making a donation to the Heroes Initiative, you get this PDF of these comics. I only do like a 1-pager in there, but it's a whole bevy of amazing Brooklyn-based and countrywide cartoonists doing their pieces on their experiences in the pandemic.
That's excellent. Is there any talk about doing a physical edition?
There is talk. This doesn't seem the time to do it now. Okay. It's just like, with stores just ramping up, just opening up in parts of the country. There will eventually, I think, be an actual print version of this, but for now it exists only as a PDF.
Excellent. Okay, well, I look forward to that if that comes, and certainly to the wrap of the Olympians, and because those are great books, and Asgardians as well. That sounds great.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting.
Yeah, Daniel, do you have something you'd like to plug?
Yeah, so here's something that each of you can do to help with the presidential election to fight voting misinformation. So you go to the MacLeod website, macleod.org. We just announced this week a plugin for Chrome and Firefox. So you go to the MacLeod site. One of the lead stories is about the election protection tracker, and you install this plugin. And then when you're using Facebook, if you see deceptive information or misleading about the election, you right-click on it, you send it to us, and we put that in the hands of groups that are helping to protect the election.
Fantastic. That's great. Excellent. That's the kind of plug that the kind of non-commercial plug we like. That's really nice. Fantastic. I hope lots of people do that. Once again, I want to thank you guys for this book. It was great. It is timely. It is a book that we need. It has a lot of information in it, and it's fun. That's the best part about it. That it's not not scholarly, though it has every piece of information, and it has a 20-page index. You can follow up every piece of information in this book, and yet it's also a joy to read. It's a genuine joy to read. So thank you for this so much. Next month's book, just for those watching at home, is going to be Displacement here by Kiki Hughes, which is a really, really fine book. Also from First Second, coincidentally enough, but that is how it worked out. And then we've got Stephen Bissett coming in, not Alan Moore. He doesn't like his name on these books anymore. Coming in for Saga the Swamp Thing as our classic selection. So look forward to those conversations next month. I want to thank Jordan for doing the show. I want to thank Zoe and all the staff for keeping the stores running, because otherwise I couldn't do these interviews and have these Flights of Fancy without that. I want to thank our sponsors at The Beat. For letting us do these shows and getting them out to a wider audience. I want to thank our publishers for working with us, helping us get the book plates and things like that. And I certainly want to thank Daniel and George here for doing a fantastic book. If you're looking for something to read, you're sitting at home, I don't know what to do, I'm worried. UNRIG, this is the book for you. Please go out and buy a copy. We'll sell you one too, but buy it anywhere you can get it, because it's that good. Thank you again. We'll talk to you next month.